to Sci-Fi area. It's so nice and lovely out there, especially on a day like today where it's nice and sunny. I'm hoping that things with COVID-19 pass fairly quickly and that you guys can maybe have me out again where I can present in person. I've always enjoyed being around you guys. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk about the U.S. economy. I'm going to talk about the Texas economy, and then I'm going to talk about the Houston economy, give you some idea of what you can expect. So let's go ahead and start with the U.S. economy. You know, I always like to have some sort of transition slide, some way to introduce a section. Trying to figure out what would be the best way to introduce a set of slides on the U.S. economy. And unfortunately, I think this is probably the best way to introduce it, just an arrow pointing down, because just about all the indicators we see out there for the U.S. haven't been trending up. They've been trending down. You want to look at probably the best overall way to look at the U.S. economy, and that's with the GDP. It kind of sums up all the measures out there. And you can see that GDP in the first quarter fell 4.8%, and it ended the longest expansion that we had on record. The bars I'm showing you, this isn't everything. If I was going to show you everything every quarter, I'd go off the left-hand side of the chart and go out my front door. So what I'm doing is just showing you the last 5 years, and you can see how strong growth has been, pretty steady. We had maybe a weak quarter back in 2015, but if you look at that, the U.S. economy has been growing pretty steadily at about a 2% annual rate each quarter, going back all the way back to 2010. And then you see that one red bar, that drop of 4.8% in GDP in the first quarter. And it's interesting, if you need to think about it in this way, is a quarter of a year is 13 weeks, if I did my math right. And we really didn't start to shut down the economy until around March 10th. So 10 of those 13 weeks, we had pretty strong growth. And then the last 3 weeks were horrendous. And the last 3 weeks were bad enough to pull all the growth down in the first 10 weeks. So we finished up with a negative growth, or a shrinking GDP by about almost 5%. Just in those last 3 weeks of March, the economy shrunk by almost 5%. If you read the forecast, if you talk to other economists and look at the data, the second quarter is actually going to be much worse. Even though we're starting to open things up, we had a very bad April, a very bad first 2 weeks of May. And it's going to be a fairly slow recovery if you look at some of the data that's out there. Oh, let me back up. I'm sorry. I'm a little ahead of myself. I'm going to show you something about the second quarter in a moment, but I need to let you know that the Bureau of Economic Analysis is a group that prepares the GDP data. And they don't look at manufacturing and construction and restaurant sales and retail sales and so forth. They kind of look at these broad categories that get lumped in. And you can see they're saying that consumer spending went down, business investment went down, inventory bills went down, exports, it's net exports minus imports. We're exporting less last quarter. The only thing that showed a little bit of a bright spot was residential construction and government expenditures. And so you could see that all these major sectors declined in the first quarter. If you want to look at what we're expecting in the second quarter, and these are forecasts by a number of prominent organizations that you guys are probably familiar with. You can see Wells Fargo Economics, you can see Goldman Sachs, IHS Markit, which is a consulting firm, JP Morgan, and so forth. And if you're an optimist, you believe in the Wells Fargo forecast and believe that the GDP is only going to decline 22% next quarter or this quarter. If you're a pessimist, you go with the Congressional Budget Office and say it's going to decline 40%. What a big drop. But if you just want to take the average, we're looking at a decline in GDP this quarter based on these forecasts of about 30 to 35%. Fairly dramatic drop off. The same forecasts start to see growth again in the third quarter and start to pick up again in the fourth quarter. But all these forecasts show a pretty precipitous drop in the second quarter, which we're about halfway through right now. And then start to see gradual recovery in the third and continued recovery in the fourth. But none of the forecasts show us getting back to where we were at the end of the year. we will finish up 2020 with a smaller economy and fewer jobs than we started 2020 with. A lot of people think that it won't be until the middle of 2021. Some forecasters say it won't be until the end of 2021 that we would capture everything. It's really hard to forecast right now because this is such an unprecedented situation. This downturn isn't based on a collapse in the financial markets like the Great Recession, or a loss in business confidence like we had in 2001 and 2002, or a spike in oil prices that we had in 1990. This is based on a deliberate decision to shut down large swaths of the economy to try to prevent a disastrous outbreak of COVID-19. And as we start to reopen, we are reopening gradually, and part of it's going to be how the pace at which we reopen. But growth will depend upon how people feel about going back to work, how safe they feel going to a restaurant, whether they feel comfortable making large purchases, seeing what's happened in the economy. There are a couple things that are happening out there. One is a lot of people lost jobs, and so they don't have the income. And the other is this concept known as the wealth effect, where if you feel that you are better off, you're likely to spend more money, or if you feel that you're worse off, you're likely to spend less. A lot of people's 401ks took hits. A lot of people's stock portfolios took hits, and they feel that they are less well off, so they're probably going to be less likely to spend. And so you're not going to see consumption return to the pace it was prior to the downturn. But let's talk a little bit about unemployment and what we see out there. This is US data right here. These are initial claims for unemployment insurance. And you can look and see that yellow bar, that yellow column. That's how many claims were filed in the US same week last year. The blue bar is this year. And you need to understand that you have to put 3 zeros behind each one of those numbers for them to make sense. So one of the things you see, a couple of things you see here, it's kind of nice to see a downward trend in initial claims. So it shows that fewer people are being let go, but it's still at a fairly high elevated level. And you can see where we were the end of the week ending May 9th compared to where we were the same week last year. Still a very high level. And you take all these numbers and you add them together, and you come up to around 35 million people in the US have filed initial claims for unemployment insurance. That's absolutely phenomenal. That's like 1 in every 5, 1 in every 6 workers in the US is out of work. Now, these numbers are probably overstate somewhat the level of unemployment because you will have duplicate claims in here. You have people filing for claims which are ineligible. You'll find other reasons why claims get thrown out. But it does also include not just people who lost their job, but gig workers who no longer have their contract work or their gigs, and self-employed. So it won't show up in the payroll numbers, but it is an indication of total jobs lost in the US. And the unemployment rate, it hit 14.7%. That's the highest on record going back to the Great Depression. That's higher than it got during the peak of the Great Recession that we just went through. And we weren't keeping really good records on unemployment during the Great Depression of the 1930s, but scholars and economists think that the unemployment rate got up to around 25%. Hopefully we won't get there, but I feel fairly, I don't want to say confident, because confident implies something good. It wouldn't surprise me to see the unemployment rate get above 20%. Really wouldn't, especially with the level of claims. So one thing that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, is they publish this long historical series of data, not quite back to the Great Depression, but I pulled data just for the last 20 years, and you can see what unemployment rate has done for the US. You can see that downturn associated with the loss of business confidence, the attack on the twin trade towers in New York, the collapse of Enron. The unemployment rate barely got above 6%, and then it worked its way down. And you can see that very middle, you can see where the unemployment rate got just barely above 10% in the Great Recession. And we worked ourselves down. And maybe you remember the headlines back in January, back in February's unemployment rate at a historic low. And then you can see it's just what's happened in March and April. And now we're at perhaps an historic high for unemployment, at least an historic high for this decade, for this year, well, this century, for the last 50 years. And you can just see how much it has shot up. One of the things BLS does, it does publish data on unemployment by different cohorts. Now, this sort of data that you're looking at on the screen right now, this is US data. We can't get this level of detail for the Houston metropolitan area. But I really don't think that the metropolitan data would look very much different than the US data. We are part of the US, and our economy starts to depend more and more on what's happened with the US economy and less on what's happened with oil. But you can look and see where we were in March and then where we were in April. And you can look and see the unemployment rate for adult men. You can see the unemployment rate for women and for teenagers. In essence, what you're looking at is the unemployment rate for almost all these groups has tripled or quadrupled, that you can see. If you want to look at unemployment rate by race or ethnicity, once again, you can see a doubling or a tripling of the rates across all these groups. If you look at the rates in April, those are the highest rates on record for every one of these racial or ethnic groups except for blacks. Blacks had a slightly higher unemployment rate than they have now. They had a slightly higher unemployment rate during the Great Recession. And then you can look at the unemployment rate for educational attainment. And you can see where we were. There was a lot of talk back in January and February and March how the benefits of the long expansion are finally working their way down to those who are less skilled and more challenged finding work. That lasted about 2 or 3 months. And then you can look and see where the unemployment rate for those with less than a high school diploma has tripled. You can see for the high school graduate, it's more than tripled. You can see the associate degree, the bachelor's degree. There's a couple takeaways from this. One thing you can see, there's no group that's really immune, but it does show that the higher level of education that you have, the less likely you are to lose your job during a downturn. It's a higher level of education you have, the more likely you are to have just a job over the long run. The unemployment rate was only 2.5% for those that had a bachelor's degree or higher back in March. So that's it for unemployment. Let me talk a little bit about, let me back up one slide. And you can see that the job losses, as Reuters say, the worst in April since the Great Depression. What I have here, I've actually added the job losses for both March and April together. So you can see where we are in the US. You can see the US has lost over 21 million jobs. That's a drop, it's a reduction of 13.5% in total employment. You can look at the top 7 industries that have lost the most jobs. These are ranked by total number of jobs. Shouldn't surprise anybody that food services and drinking places has led the way with almost 6 million job losses, or about half of everybody who works in that sector. You go down professional and business services, another 2.2 million. At 9.9%, another way to look at that is 1 out of every 10 professionals has lost their job during this downturn. I look at the retail trade data and I'm having a hard time believing that. I suspect maybe there's an error in that, considering we pretty much shut down all the retail except for grocery stores and some of the big box stores. The data will get revised. I wouldn't be surprised if when we get the data for May, BLS has gone back and revised the data for April. Healthcare and social services, 1.5 million jobs lost. You know, all elective procedures have been postponed. Visits to the dentist have been postponed. I mean, people don't like going to the dentist anyway, much less going to the dentist when they're worried about catching something. Of course, this is part of the mandate by so many governors, is to shut down the dentist's office and the doctor's offices. And if you go and you look at, there's another set of data that you can pull from the Texas Workforce Commission. And if you look at the 13 Houston County area, they actually give you a little bit more narrow breakdown. The number 1 sector that's lost jobs in the 13 county area in Houston is retail. The number 2 is actually dentist offices. Lost more jobs than any other sector. But you can keep on going down. You see manufacturing, you can see arts, recreation, and entertainment. Other services where you have repair services fit in there, like appliance repair or auto repair. But that's also where you'll see barbers, and you'll see hair salons and nail parlors and places like that show up in other services. Now I'm just going to go on down. You can see construction, government, and so forth. Every one of these sectors has lost jobs. If you look at mining and logging, that's where energy falls in. Mining and logging held up fairly well till beginning of April. And I suspect we're going to get more steep losses when the May data shows up. One of the problems when you look at data like this, this is actually based on a survey of employers. The data that I showed you earlier on unemployment rate is based on a survey of households. So they're not actually going to match up. But one of the things when you look at the survey of employers, the question is asked about the number of people who are on payroll the week or the pay period that included the 12th day of the month. So if anybody who was still being paid as of March 12th or April 12th don't show up in these numbers, anybody who's been let go since April 12th, it is not in these numbers. If you're on payroll prior to the 12th, you're in these, you're employed by BLS measures. After the 12th, you don't show up in the numbers. So I suspect with the layoffs that we saw, especially if you look at the peaking of those unemployment insurance claims in late April, that we're going to see more significant job losses when the data is reported for May. Now, there was some hiring in February, not very much, but the hiring actually comes in areas that shouldn't surprise anybody. Courier services hired, that's UPS and FedEx and all these people who are working like mad to deliver these Amazon packages or the other e-commerce. Computer manufacturers, a lot of people are working from home. There's a lot more need for telecommuting and for the support for that. That's why you see computer manufacturers surging. Federal government, it seems like they never seem to cut very many jobs. You know, the surge in federal government may have a little bit to do with the census, which we were trying to gather in March and April. So that may be one of the reasons why we saw that employment go up. Monetary authorities is the Federal Reserve. You can look at other information services. That's where streaming falls in. That's where Hulu, or that's where Netflix or these others. So that's going to grow. And general merchandise stores. That's Target and Walmart and Dollar General and so forth like that. So getting a little bit of feedback. Would everybody please make sure that they have their microphone on mute while I'm talking, please? Thank you. What you're seeing here is a Purchasing Managers Index for the entire U.S. I often show this for the Houston area, but it is gathered on the national basis, and you can look at it here. This is a survey of purchasing managers across the nation, all 50 states, asking all these sort of questions about production and sales and employment and inventory and prices. Crunch all these numbers together, and the Institute comes up with an index, and whenever that index is above the red line, that's a sign the U.S. economy, at least the manufacturing side, is expanding. When it falls below the red line, that's a sign it's contracting. Now you can go look at the far left-hand side, and you can see the Great Recession showing up real clearly there. And you slide on over a little bit. Excuse me, I'm going to get a little sip. And you can look at the 16 and 17. That's actually the downturn in the fracking bust showing up in the manufacturing data in the U.S. data. And you can see how what happened in Texas did weigh on the U.S. economy. And you go over to that far right side, you can see the PMI fell from 50 to 42. It's 8 points below an area that would indicate expansion. It's not just the fact that it's below, but look how steep that drop off. It's like manufacturing in the U.S. fell off a cliff. Now, this is data as of April. And so when we get the May data, I suspect, I know we will not be back above red. I suspect we may fall below 40 then, because manufacturing really took it in April and it's slow to come back. So that's it about the U.S. All those charts, all those words that I gave you reflect what's going on in the U.S. I'd like to talk a little bit about Texas. Texas, our Texas, all hail the mighty state. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm digressing a little bit. This is Texas economic activity. What I'm going to show you some data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. This is my transition slide. I thought it was kind of cute. They actually have a mask, and someone took a red marker on the mask and showed it kind of as a decline, which is pretty much sums up what's going on. The COVID has really been a drag on the Texas economy. If you want to look at unemployment claims, you can look at these here. It's just like I showed you for the U.S. The left bar is last year, the red bar is this year, green bar is last year. And you can see where claims are. The state of Texas, 2 million claims, absolutely phenomenal job losses. Unfortunately, though, we still don't know how many people lost their job in Texas because there's such a lag in when employers are surveyed, when the data is collected, and then when it's reported. And it won't be until this Friday, May 22nd, that we actually know how many job losses took place in April. And if you remember, I told you it's who was on the payroll as of the pay period, including the 12th of the month. But any job losses which took place in the last half of March are going to show up in the April data. This is when we really expect to see a really big hit. The numbers are just going to be staggering. And it shouldn't surprise anybody, given the level of unemployment insurance claims we see filing, the number of job losses we expect to see this Friday. So let's talk just a little bit about the Texas manufacturing sector. The Fed does a survey of manufacturers in the state, asks them a whole bunch of questions. There are probably about 10, 12 rows of data I could show you that's way too much to show on the screen. So I just picked 4 that I thought were the most relevant: production, capacity utilization, new orders and shipments. You know, they asked the question, the Fed asked the question, is your production increasing or decreasing, or has it not changed? Are your new orders increasing or decreasing? And you can look in that left-hand column and see the number of respondents that said that these indicators were increasing or in the single digits. And you go over to the far right-hand side, and the number of respondents who said that their production and their orders and their shipments were decreasing is in the high double digits. Showed you this huge drop-off in economic activity. You know, what economists like to do is we will create something called the diffusion index, and we'll mush the two together. We'll take the two and we'll kind of squeeze the increases and the decreases together to give it some idea. And that's what you're seeing, mushing going on here, this mixing of the two to give you some idea of just what's happening with manufacturing. Now you lump the increase with the decrease, and what you're hoping to see in that far right-hand column is a positive number, a highly positive number. But what you're seeing is this index that's showing a negative number, a fairly highly negative number. It just goes to show just there's so many more firms out there reporting decreases in their manufacturing activity than they're reporting increases. It's a way to illustrate the amount of pain going on in manufacturing in Texas. So let me back up. I hit that too quick. So let's talk about the service sector. This is going to be restaurants. This will be retail. Healthcare falls in here. Professional services, things of that nature. Once again, a Dallas Fed survey of the number of service companies in the state, asking questions about revenue and employment, the number of hours their employees are working, what they're getting for the selling prices. And you can see only very marginal, very few firms said they saw an increase in these areas, but a huge number saw a decrease. You can see, you know, almost 74% of the firms that responded to the survey said that their revenues decreased in April compared to March. You can see over a third said they decreased their employment. You can see almost two-thirds said the hours that their employees are working have fallen. So once again, you kind of pour one number into the other, you mush them together, and you come up with this index. On the far right-hand side, you really want to see that number green. You want to see it positive. But when you see that it's red and you see it so negative, that's a sign that just so many more companies out there are reporting decreases in activity and revenues and employment and hours worked and selling prices. It just shows you just how much pain the service sector in Texas is undergoing or was undergoing in April. So that was it for Texas. You know, you've got your index there, and you've got your other indexes, so you can just see how much pain is going on in Texas. So let's talk a little bit about Houston. And I'll let you know, when I say Houston, I'm actually talking about the metropolitan Houston area. I'm talking about Austin and Brazoria and Chambers and Fort Bend and Galveston and Harris and Liberty, Montgomery, Waller counties, you know, the 9 counties that make up the metro area. And there are 1 or 2 places I'll talk about City of Houston specific data. That's just kind of an illustration or a proxy, and also gives you some idea, though, of what's going on with the city that many of us live in or work in. So this is initial claims for unemployment insurance. Once again, that red bar represents the level of claims last year. The blue bar represents the number of claims this year. You see, looks like we peaked late March, early April, and you can see that general trending down Now, I need to let you know that about 11 o'clock, the Texas Workforce Commission did post data for May 9th, the week ending May 9th, and it was around 36,000. So we are continuing to see the trendward down, but it's still at a fairly high elevated level. We're seeing unemployment insurance claims 10 to 12 times higher than they should be. Now, you add all these numbers together going all the way across the top. Yes, we're trending down, but total claims for unemployment insurance in the 9-county area now exceed 400,000. There are 400,000 people that have lost their job, that have lost their contract to do work, that have lost their gig. Gives you some idea just the level of pain that's going on in the region right now. This is the Purchasing Managers Index. This is very similar to what I showed you for the US. I know when I presented to you guys in the past, I've had this slide up there on the screen. Once again, ask a series of questions about sales and production and employment and inventories. Crunch all those numbers, you come up with this index. Whenever the blue line is above the red line, that's a sign the economy is expanding. And go to the far left-hand side, you can see what happened in 09, the Great Recession. Go to 15 and 16, you see that dip in the wiggly line? That is the fracking bust. That shows you, it shows up there when we had almost no jobs created. While the energy industry was hemorrhaging jobs, we created a few in other sectors and just barely lost a few jobs. Go over that dip between 17 and 18, that's the impact Hurricane Harvey had on the economy. And then go look at that far right-hand side. And you can see how precipitous a drop that was. The PMI fell to 34. And we wanted above 50 because 50 signals the economy is expanding and will continue to expand for the next 3 to 4 months. It is very much below 50. At 34, that is the lowest point on record for this data series. Back during the Great Recession in March of 09, the PMI fell to 39, and now it's at 34. So basically, the level of inactivity or pain or contraction in Houston's economy in the last 2 months is worse than it was in the entire Great Recession. You know, it took us a year or so to get where we were in the Great Recession, you know, back on to fall this low, to fall as low as we did then. It only took us 2 months to set a new record. Let's go on and look at a couple of other indicators. This is the Chemicals Manufacturing Barometer. Now this is a US data point. This is put together by the American Chemistry Council, and they're looking at some of the same sort of things that the people put together the PMI look at. They look at employment, they look at sales, they look at production, they look at the number of rail cars that are being loaded with chemicals. And yes, this is a US data point, but so much of the US chemical industry is concentrated in the 9-county area. A lot of it's along the Ship Channel in Harris County. There's a lot in Brazoria County. There's a lot in Galveston County. There's some in Montgomery County even where we see some chemical production. In Liberty and Chambers. And so what's ever happening in the US chemical industry, it's happening here in Houston, or whatever's happening in Houston is reflected back into this chart. And you can see what's happening with chemicals, how far they've fallen, 15% in this index of general activity in April. Chemicals pay very well. They have a very high jobs multiplier. You don't need a whole lot of people to run a chemical plant, but you need a whole lot of people to maintain it. The welders and the construction workers and so forth. So anytime the chemical industry struggles, it's going to hurt Houston. This is DBA filings, doing business as for Harris County. When businesses start up, one of the things they do is they file for a DBA, they incorporate and they file for a DBA. They want to secure that name before anybody else secures it. You know, it's kind of a metric of new business startups. I put this in there. And you can see how weak startup activity has been, that light blue line compared to the dark brown line, or the dark brown, excuse me. I'm not colorblind, that's a dark blue line. And you can see how activity has dropped off. So what you're looking at there is home sales for April this year versus April last year. This is the Houston Association of Realtors. You can see the drop off in new listings, the drop off in active listings, the weakness in prices. Saw some pretty precipitous drops. It's not just because the economy is so weak. There were you get individuals who don't want to list their house are individuals who listed their house in February and since pulled it off the market because they don't want strangers coming into their house. They don't want someone who may have the virus come into their house and touch their doorknobs or open up their cabinets or sit at their table, worrying that they might leave the virus behind. And so that's one reason why you're seeing sales of new sales of resale homes, used sale homes, existing homes so weak. You've actually seen pretty strong growth in new homes. The reports that we get back from the home builders say that their sales have held up well up to this point. That could be a couple phenomenons. One of the phenomenon is that a new home is considered a safer purchase than a used home. If no one has ever lived in the home, it's less likely to have the virus in it. Also, new homes, the builders are being very, very, I want to say flexible, but they're willing to make deals more so. And part of it is that you get individuals who had their heart set. It was a New Year's resolution that they were going to be in a new home this year. And so they haven't given up on their purchases yet. Some of the builders, I've actually some of them say that things are actually better than they should be. And there's concern that maybe what they're doing is pulling sales out of the future part of the year, sales out of the second half of the year into the first half of the year. They're kind of worried about what's going to happen when we get to June and July, which should be a prime selling period. We should be in a prime selling period now and wondering whether we've just borrowed from the future on this. But you can definitely see weakness in the resale homes, and it's a little bit of concern of whether we're pulling sales forward for the new home market. Let's look at airport traffic. This is through both airports. This is from Houston Airport System, both Bush Airport and Houston Hobby. And we're looking at the March data. We don't have the April data yet. We won't have it for some time. And you can look and see where March 2020 was compared to the previous Marches. You remember, we were still pretty active up until mid-March or at least the first 2 weeks of March, and then everything started to shut down. And so the little bit of air traffic that you see there really reflects the first 2 weeks of March before things slowed down. If you want to get some idea of where we are now this is US data, this is national data, and this is from the Transportation Safety Administration, and they actually count the number of people who go through their checkpoints. And that top line is how many they were handling this time last year, and the bottom line is where we are this year. And you can see that the amount of passengers that TSA is handling has dropped off by over 90%. So if this is happening nationwide, there's no reason why it's any different here in Houston. I talked to friends and associates out of the airport, and they say you drive by and you just see the jets lined up along the taxiways because there's no place to store them. They're parked out there waiting for business to return. It's a bit of a concern because if you listen to the CEO of Boeing, he said he doesn't think normal level of air service will return for 3 or maybe 5 years. Now that has implications for Houston. One is it makes it difficult for us to do business elsewhere. Yes, there's a certain amount of leisure travel, but also we need to get out and call on clients. There are lots of jobs that are supported by aviation. The last to probably recover will be international air service. And that probably is one of my biggest concerns regarding aviation, is because the international services, we have an awful lot of business that we do overseas, and we need to be able to call on clients overseas, or we need companies to come visit Houston. There's a lot of foreign investment here, and we want to continue to have foreigners invest to set up factories and plants and so forth. And if they can't get here, if we can't get there, it's going to put a crimp on our ability to do business globally, which has been so important to the economy. So this is one. This is maybe it's a little bit silly. This is mixed beverages sold in the city of Houston. This is both bars and restaurants. I like to look at February. I guess February is when we had Mardi Gras and maybe the first parts of the rodeo. Now, think about that. We sold $100 million worth of mixed drinks in the city of Houston in that month. And we started to shut things down in March, and then you can look at where we were in April, sold less than $13,000 worth of mixed drinks. For one thing, it gives you an indication of just how severely we shut down the bars and the restaurants. But it's also a suggestion of what the city of Houston and other municipalities are going to be going through as far as tax revenues. The city gets revenues from these sales, from these mixed beverages, and their revenues are down. If you want to go and look at it another way, this is just total sales tax collections for the city of Houston in March. We don't have April data yet. There's a 2-month lag in the data. The March data became available in May. The April data will become available in June. And you can see the drop off there. And when the data comes out, we'll see it drop off even further. So Houston's not unique. You saw a drop off in retail sales, also a drop off in business purchases, because it's not just the consumer that pays sales taxes, businesses pay sales taxes as well. And that's one of the reasons why the city of Houston is looking at layoffs, and it's going to be tight budgets for so many of these other municipalities. There are, gosh, I think the last time I counted, 110, 120 cities and municipalities that levy a sales tax in the 9-county area. And so they're potentially looking at losses in revenues for all of these, or at least revenues being flat. Okay, so I can't talk about Houston without talking about energy. Energy is one of the drivers of our economy. Probably remember maybe my last presentation when I talked to you guys out there, there are 3 things which are key to Houston's economy. The one is the US economy, one is the global economy, and the other is oil or energy. And all 3 of them are doing poorly right now, and energy is doing exceptionally poorly. If you want to look at refinery utilization, you can see it in this chart right here. We're not processing as much through our refineries because the demand just isn't there for gas or for diesel or aviation fuels. Ideally, you want the refineries operating above 90%. Right now, they're barely operating above 70%. Now, you can look at that and see refineries across the US, especially in the Gulf Coast, are operating even below where they were during Hurricane Harvey. Gives you some idea how demand has slacked off. So, oil is real cheap right now. The refineries would be glad to buy it, but they have from the oil companies, but there's no one to sell it to. There's no place to store it. You can see what's happened with crude prices. I do know that crude got up to $25 and $30 a barrel, around 35. I think that's probably going to slip back down to 30 because we aren't quite seeing the demand there, but I'm not going to focus on that. I want to focus on this chart right here. And this is what we're seeing with the rig count. Now, a rig count is an indicator of future exploration activity. It's also an indication of future employment in the oil and gas sector. And you can see where we were at the height of the fracking boom. You can see the fracking bust at 404 rigs. And then you can get down to where we were last week, only 374 rigs working in the US. So we have fewer rigs working now than we did at the bottom of the fracking bust. And I'm concerned the rig count will fall even further. It could fall below 300. And so if you have fewer rigs working in the field, you don't need as many oil field workers. Fewer rigs working in the field, you don't need as much equipment or pipes or valves or so forth. If you have fewer rigs working in the field, you don't need as many people back in Houston supervising the operations because they have a lot fewer wells that they need to supervise. So we've already started seeing layoffs in oil field services. We're starting to see them in manufacturing, and I'm concerned we're going to start to see them happen if they haven't already, as we'll see in the data, in the exploration side, the white collar side. At its peak, energy broadly defined in Houston employed over 300,000 people. During the fracking bust, it fell to around 220. We recaptured about 30,000 of those jobs. I'm concerned that we're about to lose that 30,000 again and then some. We will never see employment in the energy sectors get back to where it was in December 2014. I'm afraid this is something we're going to be living with for a very long time. You can see, and this is the story is being reported in Bluebug. Oil spirals down below zero. That was back in April. The industry's begun to shut in production, stop producing because there's no one to buy it. And then you're starting to see a little bit of recovery. One maybe bright spot in this is that the initial estimates of how far production was going to fall seem to have been off. At one time, the consensus was, let me back up, the world consumes 100 million barrels of oil a day. And I'll repeat that so you know that I didn't misstate. In a normal time, the world consumes 100 million barrels of oil a day. The consensus among forecasters was that consumption was going to fall by 30 million barrels. We only need 70 million barrels. They've gone back and revisited their models, and they're saying, well, maybe consumption will only fall by 10 million barrels. Well, even if consumption is down 10 million barrels, the U.S. is only producing about 12 million, so you'd pretty much need to, you could eliminate all U.S. production and maybe then get a balanced market. The recovery is going to be slow in the oil and gas sector because the recovery in the oil and gas sector is going to depend so much on what happens with the rest of the economy. It's going to depend upon how comfortable we feel getting back to work, driving around. Even if a lot of companies institute telecommuting policies, people aren't going to be using their cars as much. So it's going to be a while before we see the demand for refined products come back, and by extension, then for crude, which means Houston's oil sector is probably going to struggle up at least for the next 12 months. So, yeah, I know I've hit you with a lot of negative stuff. Please don't consider it negative. I'm just trying to be realistic. I figure you need to hear or see what's going on out there. If I came back and said everything was rosy, you would ask what was in that glass sitting by my side. It's not water, but yes, it is water. What you're seeing right there is there are some rays of sunshine poking through. One of the rays of sunshine is that the number of respondents, we do a survey at the partnership every week. The number of respondents indicating their situation is improving has been inching up every week. Governor Abbott issued his order that we could start reopening May 1st. And in the last survey, we had 2% said they'd fully reopened, and you got 17% said they're partially. So basically, if you look at this, you see firms are starting to reopen. So we are starting to see some recovery out there. And that's actually about it, guys. Things have been pretty rough the last half of March, all of April, first 2 weeks of May. But we are starting to see a gradual recovery, and need to understand that there's a difference between recovery and growth. You're going to talk about the recovery. Basically, we need to recoup all the jobs we've lost. We need to replace the lost GDP and get back to where we were in February before we start to see growth. We've got 35 million Americans unemployed. We easily have 250 most likely in Houston unemployed when we get the next data set. It's going to take a little bit of time, but it does seem like restrictions are easing up and people are becoming a little bit more comfortable going out publicly. So let's just keep our fingers crossed that there's not a second wave, and let's just all stay focused and do the best we can to get the economy back on track. So with that, I'm done. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I know I talked a little bit long, but at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll be glad to take some questions now. So thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Patrick. This is Paula Harvey.
I'm sorry, Paula.
That's all right. We appreciate you so much and your honest and professional opinion. We know it's not all rosy right now, but it looks like in the chat room we have a couple questions. The first one is, if this downturn persists like the last depression did during the 1930s, do you see local and federal government establish programs like the CCC, WPA, and then in 1964 and 65, Johnson's Great Society to help give workers skills and income?
Something will need to be done, but I don't think it'll be a WPA type program. You have to think about, we're looking at 90 years ago, actually. The economy was much different. We were much more oriented towards manufacturing, much more towards construction, still agrarian. Well, not agrarian, but still a lot of people living on the farms. And so it was easier to spend money to build things. There's a lot of talk about how the infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, how we've got deteriorating infrastructure in the US. So that would be a logical place to build it. But we don't have as many people employed in construction as we have elsewhere. Remember, I showed you all those numbers of job losses. We've had 23 million jobs lost so far, but only 1 million are in construction. So I'm not sure you could take someone from healthcare and put them operating a backhoe, or someone in retail and have them swinging a hammer. I guess maybe they could. Something will need to be done, and it would be nice that whatever money the federal government spends is put into some sort of infrastructure. There'll probably need to be some training that go along with that. Now, if this thing persists on another 12 months, I think we're going to really rethinking about how the economy is organized and what we're doing. Something will need to be done to make sure we don't have dire poverty extending out. One thing in the data, when you look at the data at a national level, and I said on unemployment, and the unemployment is based on a survey of households, and they call households up and they ask about people in the household, are they working or they're not working, and if they're working, are they looking for work? And there's a subset of that, and 75% of the people who responded to the survey that said they were unemployed, 75% of them said that they're unemployed, but they expect to be called back to work eventually. So if that happens, that means rather than having, I'm gonna make the math simple, rather than having 24 million people unemployed, we'll only have 6 million people unemployed. But still, 6 million people is a large number. And the downturn, I mean, in the expansion that we had, job growth averaged 200,000 jobs a month. We're adding jobs at the rate of 200,000. So if that 75% goes back to work, it still leaves another 6 million. You're still looking at 2.5, 3 years to recoup all the jobs that we lost. So we got into this fairly quickly, fairly steeply. I don't feel this is going to be a V-shaped recovery. It's going to be more like a U-shape. And the question is how wide is the bottom of that U going to be?
Yeah. So we have another question. Because of the downturn, manufacturers, let me see what this says, hold on. Downturn was manufactured. Could the projected upturn be more optimistic than what so many are projecting now? I think you kind of answered that question in this last statement.
Yeah, it's real hard when I say this. I've done a lot of reading and talked to my colleagues out there. And we build models to forecast what's going on in the economy. Models are based on different inputs. But no one's built a model based on a virus. They built models based on an increase in exports, or a model based on a drop in government spending. And so this thing is really hard to forecast. It all comes down to, put it bluntly, COVID-19 is in the driver's seat and how we respond to it. And if, as we're going back, as the economy reopens, we don't see a surge, the economy will open faster. If we do see a surge, some people may pull back. If we see a huge surge, we may be back where we were. It's all going to depend upon how COVID-19 itself plays out over the next 6 weeks or the next 6 months, and then how we as society respond to that. It may be we're going to accept the fact that people said it'll always be with us, and may we accept the fact that there are people, a tenth of the office is not working because they have COVID-19. I'm just throwing that out. It's going to depend upon how we adapt to this and how acceptable it is for us to go out in public and go to restaurants and work at a lathe next to someone else working it next to a lathe. So that's the big unknown.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one more question I want to ask, and I think we're going to end it there, and we'll share this video and this presentation with everyone. But, do you have any idea of a percentage of companies that are not going to reopen? Of course, the question is about this area, but, even as Texas or as Houston, how do you monitor that? And are you going to have a number on that?
I actually get asked this question a couple of times. I don't have a good answer for that. The businesses which are the most at risk are the small businesses. One is because they operate on thin margins to begin with. They don't have a lot of capital. You can put that into, you can look at it as restaurants and bars and some of the smaller manufacturers. If they were able to get some federal assistance, they'll be able to hang on, but there are a lot of firms, as we hear in the headlines, have not gotten that assistance. So one thing, there are always a number of firms that go out of business every day, every month. You have firms that start up, and in good times, there are more firms start up that go out of business. I'm not real And it's going to depend. 6 weeks, 2 months, maybe business could last that long. But if we're still only in a partial reopening another month from now, I can see that the number of closures increasing. But I can't forecast how many are going to go bankrupt or how many are going to shut down. But I will say that it falls most heavily on the small business.
That's understandable. I cannot imagine how we would even track that. We just have to take it word of mouth here at the chamber too, locally, and talk to a lot of our businesses and see what they say and how they're doing. So we hope to survey them as well.
We'll probably know a year from now because of data lags, but we won't know until then.
All right. Well, thank you, Patrick. We really, really appreciate you being here. You're an expert, and we know you're working hard right now, harder than ever, and look forward to having you back when there's great news or more positive upturns on some of these.
I'll be glad to come back. And I guess the one thing I just say, make sure you guys continue to support your local chamber. They're so key to us keeping the economy running. So, and I'm glad to come out anytime to speak to you guys.
Thank you again. We really appreciate you. Thank you all for being here and being on Zoom with us, and stay connected, jump into our other committees as well, as Leslie said at the beginning. So we look forward to seeing you sometime in the near future. Thank you. Have a great day.